All right, welcome everyone. This is our live online class at UC Davis Extension titled California Wildfire Strategies for Planning and Mitigation, which I'm expecting may last up to 2 hours, depending on how things go, unless we all collapse of exhaustion before then, which hopefully won't happen. My name is Tim Snellings. I'm retired Development Services Director from Butte County, California. I'm the lead instructor for this class. Students can use the chat function during the live session. So that'll be a tool that's available for them to ask questions and help us engage the conversation. For your information and to provide everyone viewing this discussion a little context, we have a class syllabus that includes a lot of resources that I expect everyone has completely reviewed, all 12 hours of videos, read the books. They've had all of yesterday to do that. So not probably gonna be fully covered just yet, but that's okay. There's a great book in the resources, PAS Report 594, which Molly's going to talk about. She's a co-author of that awesome resource. There's a variety of other brochures, handouts, PDFs, PowerPoints on wildfire presentations from myself and one from CPAW, which Molly may touch on as well. Online video of me interviewing my former assistant director, Pete Calarco, and his role in the campfire during the ESC operation, as well as the recovery operation. So there's some very good land use planning information there and emergency operations center information there from the perspective of a land use planner. Several other videos on the campfire, which are done quite well by NOVA, various broadcast stations. So, all right, drum roll. This is a panel discussion. With me serving as your host facilitator and my three wildfire experts, all of whom have incredible experience and expertise. I'd like to welcome my three guests, Molly, Pete, and John. Let's start by having each of you take a few minutes to introduce yourselves to the class and talk about your background with regards to wildfire safety and planning. So let's start, Molly, with you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Tim. Good morning, everyone. My name is Molly Mowry. I own and manage a consulting firm called Wildfire Planning International, and I also serve as a part-time director for the nonprofit Community Wildfire Planning Center. I am a certified land use planner, and I've been focused on wildfire planning issues for most of my planning career. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks again for the opportunity. I am based in Colorado, but I work across the US and in Canada. So a lot of my work focuses on how I can offer technical assistance to communities on where they may be able to improve their plans, codes, ordinances, and really strengthen connections across different plans, as well as look at wildfire in ways they may have never thought about before. So it's been helpful to be it's helpful now that we have a lot of interest in wildfire to be a wildfire planner. Actually, that was the focus of my thesis when I did my graduate work. So it's been a great opportunity for over 10 years to really focus on this topic.
Very good. Thank you, Molly. Pete?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pete Parkinson. I'm a semi-retired county planner. I spent my career with 3 different California counties, all of which have wildfire issues to one sort or another. And my career has really been as a planning generalist with a lot of focus on environmental planning. But I didn't become, let's say, personally, intimately interested in wildfire hazards until my house burned down in the North Bay fires in 2017 here. I live in Sonoma County. I was the planning director for the county of Sonoma for a lot of years until I retired from that position in 2013. I was most recently the president of the California chapter of the American Planning Association for 2 years, and was also the president of the California County Planning Directors Association for a couple of years back in the mid-2000s. So that's how I got to know Tim pretty well. Since I retired, I've been doing consulting work on a variety of subjects, a lot around the intersection between planning and wildfire management, the intersection between planning and groundwater management, and some open space planning work as well. So been keeping relatively busy for somebody who's supposedly retired.
You did all of that without saying Sigma. Thank you.
Yes.
John, welcome.
Hi, good morning. My name's John Gaddy. I'm a fire captain with CAL FIRE Butte County Fire Department. I'm going on my 25th year in the fire service. I've been with CAL FIRE for about 14 years. I was with local government prior to that for about 9 years. My wildfire experience dates back to when I started. I've been to numerous campaign fires all the way from San Diego up to north into Shasta. I've been over to Lake Sonoma County fires. And especially I'm very well versed, unfortunately, of fires that happen here in Butte County. I've recently, some of my background with regards to the fire service, I was an engine company, fire captain, engineer, firefighter. I've held all three ranks. I've worked in the command center, which is our dispatch center to assign resources to incidents. And currently I am working in the fire marshal's office as the land use planning coordinator. So I'm becoming very well versed in Public Resources Code 4290 and 4291, the CAL FIRE fire safe regs, which have really played a role because of the campfire and subsequent fires we've had here in the unit about rebuilding. So getting people back safely is pretty much my primary job right now.
And John, there's a little unique relationship between CAL FIRE and Butte County. You could touch on that?
Sure. Going back to, I want to say about the early 1930s, CAL FIRE, or back then, the Department of Forestry, entered into a cooperative agreement with Butte County to provide local fire protection. And so we are the county's fire department, meaning we provide the personnel, we provide the training. So in the local responsibility areas, including in the town of Paradise, Gridley, and Biggs, we provide fire protection. And that's been going on, almost 90 years right now.
Wow.
And that goes along with, state responsibility areas where we do have CAL FIRE resources. But as far as the county fire department, CAL FIRE provides the personnel to staff what they deem appropriate around the local responsibility area.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Pete, I think that's the same in Sonoma County, right? You have a CAL FIRE contract, as I recall, but maybe not.
No, actually, it's different. We have our own county fire agency here that manages, mostly serves function managing volunteer fire departments.
Okay. All right. Shifting gears a little bit here, Molly. You co-authored the, as I mentioned, PAS Report 594, Planning the Wildland-Urban Interface. Tell us a little bit about what led to writing this report and what were some of the key findings.
Sure, I even brought a visual just to, spice things up.
A visual? We have a visual. All right.
Here it is. Yeah, so a few years ago, this even predated the campfire. I think it was around 2016, 2017, APA started having a growing interest in wildfires and the WUI as a planning issue, the wildland-urban interface. And so we, in the Forest Service, the way this came to be is the Forest Service actually provided funding to the APA to look at this issue. And there had been a previous publication on wildfire back from, I think, the early 2000s, but there were somewhat dated examples. And, APA really saw this as an opportunity to give this a refresh. So, I did co-author this with 3 other co-authors, and one of them in particular I work very closely with, and I wanted to just call his work out because he brings his expertise in fire behavior and forestry. And so his name's Kelly Johnston. He really was significant in terms of contributing to a lot of the technical discussions on how fire behavior relates to the land use planning decisions that we make. The other pieces of this, though, that were interesting for me in terms of research was Chapter 2 gives a history on the WUI, and so I had to do a lot of research for that. And one of the things that still stands out in my mind is this video that I came across called Design for Disaster. you probably can't see it, but this is the page in chapter 2. There's a cutout on it. And it really, what the video talks about, it's from the, after the 1961 Bel Air fire in Southern California. I see John nodding his head, maybe he's seen it. It's just really, for me, fascinating to watch as a planner. I used to work for the National Fire Protection Association. And so, you know, what stood out to me is at the end of this 20-minute documentary, they talk about how homes were built in the wrong place and why things were burning, and how these NFPA officials came out and called this area designed for disaster. And I think it really speaks to this historical aspect that we often forget in terms of thinking this is a new problem, it's a new trend, there's all these emerging issues. And I know we'll talk about, you know, the reality of what some of those are, but I think the reality too is that there's a long story behind this. It's taken a while to get to where we are today. And so there are certainly tools and things that we're going to talk about. What I think we have to appreciate how much time it has taken to get to where we are, and what the implications are for trying to reverse those trends in the future now.
Right. Thanks for mentioning that Bel Air video. I came across that. I put a link to that on our course syllabus, so they'll have quick access to that. So
Great.
Thank you. It's a great resource, and I know that many people have already looked at it, and hopefully more will. Yeah. Thank you. Pete, I want to shift to you for a second. You, in a recent presentation mentioned that planners haven't taken wildfire hazards seriously enough in the past. I'm curious what you meant by that. Come on, Pete. I mean, really, fire issues are the purview of fire agencies, right? Come on. You're on mute. Unmute.
Okay, there we go. So I think that, you know, it's really kind of along the lines of what Molly was just talking about. And I would just put a little sharper point on it. And it's part of my realization, you know, after we went through the fires here in the North Bay, is that planners haven't really fully embraced their role in how communities and neighborhoods can develop and learn to live with wildfire as part of the landscape. And live with wildfire really is the key point there. It's not just about suppression and fighting those fires and this constant battle between, you know, development and nature. It's how do we live with wildfire on the landscape. And there's a couple of dimensions of this that I want to talk about that might at first seem kind of contradictory with regard to the relationship between planners and fire agencies in particular. And again, this is based on my experience, you know, largely on my experience in 3 counties, but I think it's a common model elsewhere as well. So 2 dimensions to this. One dimension is that we haven't involved fire protection agencies and professionals nearly enough in the front end of the planning process, at the plan making stage, at the general plan stage. So we tend to, as planners, we rely on our immediate past experience. We rely on things like the CAL FIRE's fire hazard severity zone maps. We rely on Section 4290, the Public Resources Code, for all of these standards here. But we can and we should be doing more and bringing more expertise to bear at the plan making stage. So it's involving people like Molly and her colleagues in the plan making stage. It's involving people like John at the plan making stage, where things, you know, as planners that are on this call know, things are more fluid and you have more flexibility. You have more options available to you essentially at that stage of the game. The other dimension concerns the other end of the planning process, which is the review, the development review and current planning end of the planning project, where paradoxically what I have seen planners do and have done myself is kind of hand off this issue to fire agencies to specify the requirements for a particular development. And it's not like, I don't want to suggest at all that the perspective of the fire agencies and the expertise of fire agencies at this stage of the game are as less relevant or anything like that. It's just that they are, but they aren't the whole story. And so planners like to think holistically in broad landscape-based terms when we're doing general plans and whatnot, but we don't think that way often enough when we're looking at specific development projects. So I think that we need to be, as planners, more holistically inquisitive about these things. Ask broad fundamental questions about, is this the right place? Is this the right density? Is this the right design? The kinds of questions that are posed in Molly's PAS report. And I think that if we can have a more collaborative, deeper relationship between planners and fire protection professionals, I think we're all going to be better off in this arena in the future.
Thanks. I think of the realities of the pressures that staff are under in processing projects with all of the different issues coming at them, fire being one of dozens. And it's hard, I know, to prioritize wildland fire issues and to engage in the midst of the, trying to get the application processed. So it is a big challenge, I think, for staff. Okay, thanks, Pete. So John, I'm curious about your observation of how other departments, including planning departments, view their roles in wildfire planning, mitigation, prevention, response, recovery. Do you have the sense from your perspective, your paradigm, that people just sort of think you're fire, you deal with fire, we're dealing with other stuff? Or what is your observation and experience?
Well, I think I follow up with what Pete and Molly have said, is that when it comes to fire behavior and historical fire areas, like we have in Butte County, the Concow area, or if you look down in LA, the Malibu area, or some of the historical fires that have happened in the wine country or up in Shasta County, is that when it comes to fire behavior, we're the experts, and we can interject that perspective, especially, not to bring up my partner and I, we've spent some time, we've seen what fire does, and we can relate those experiences to help people build in the wildland urban interface. We can help people with suggestions on providing them resources to build in the WUI. Just a side note, when I was dealing with the campfire, I came to find out that 34% plus or minus residences and properties in the United States are classified in the WUI, which I think that's an enormous amount of property. So from the fire perspective, and specifically in Butte County, I think we work very well by interjecting that perspective and being in the same building concurrently right now, as you know, Tim, that we can throw things off each other and really work well on having people, unfortunately, having people rebuild, or people do want to live in the wildland urban interface, providing them tips and resources to build as safely and to lessen the risk as possible. And the reason I say that is because after the campfire and several fires I've seen in my career, and dealing with specifically the campfire, is how can we prevent this? And prevent is a very, very, it's not the right term. It's how can we lessen the damage? Because you're not going to prevent fires from happening. Populations grow, and that stat I just threw out there, that 30+% people want to live in these areas. I currently live in an area that's classified as WUI, is that we need to give your property and your home the best chance to survive if a catastrophic fire impacts your area.
Cool. See your head nodding, Pete. We can't, avoid fire forever. I mean, it is part of the landscape.
Well, absolutely, and that's what I meant earlier about learning to live with fire as part of the landscape, as opposed to just suppression and fighting fires.
Yeah. Okay, so we've touched a little bit on land use, so let's dive in a little bit more. This question is for each of you to answer. How do you see local and state emergency plans, general plans, zoning ordinances, subdivision ordinances, local hazard mitigation plans, which are multi-hazard plan documents, community wildfire protection plans, emergency operations plans, and the other host of plans that exist? how do you see them all working together to be more than just a bunch of documents that sit on the shelf? So Molly, let me start with you.
Sure, I think there's the ideal version of how they work together, and then there's the reality of how they work together. And I see Pete and John nodding their heads too. And we found, I've worked in various communities across California, but many communities elsewhere as too. And it's just such a different starting point. So there's really, in my mind, there's no one formula for how there's the ideal of how they can fit together, but there's the reality of what's the starting point of what the communities are working with, what are they required to do. In California, there's actually really good guidance, I think, from the state level. What are the requirements for this, the timing of the updates, et cetera. The land use planning program that John mentioned that he's part of from CAL FIRE gives tremendous guidance for what that update process looks like. I will speak though to the ideal version for a moment. The ideal version is that there's an ongoing coordinating mechanism where different players, we were just talking about planners, fire department, other local agencies can play a part in these ongoing discussions. That can happen through something like the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, CWPPs. To take a step back in time for a moment, CWPPs came out of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, HEFRA, in 2003. And I think for a while, it's safe to say, for a lot of communities, it was a check the box exercise because it enabled them to potentially get more access to funding, or at least direct funding and priorities on adjacent national forests. So for a while, it was just quite frankly, a routine copy and paste opportunity for communities to check the box, get the plan done. It wasn't a requirement, but if you did do it, you could access some of these incentives or these ways to direct funding. But more recently, though, I think we've seen communities, fire safe councils, local governments get more creative with what the potential for a CWPP is. And that is ideally to bring together a lot of partners in the wildfire planning process and also link the right information. So not all of the technical details that you want to rely on for wildfire planning are always, or should they be found in the general plan. So for example, you may have more detailed information and priorities that come out through the CWPP. However, you want those strong linkages between the general plan and the CWPP. So there are really some great examples now of communities that have taken an in-depth planning approach, use that CWPP to be a coordinating mechanism. And then the piece to that I think is important is they've established wildfire committees or wildfire councils that meet on a regular basis to discuss and implement the plan. So it's a living document. It's not just something that sits on a shelf.
Cool. So that would be like, in my experience, we would have our general plan goals and policies, and then an action might be to develop a CWPP for either the whole jurisdiction or several for different levels of neighborhoods, communities, depending on where the threats were and if they're different. So have you ever seen multiple CWPPs in a jurisdiction, like in a county?
Yes, we have. They overlap or they nest within each other. Ideally, we see a lot on the subdivision or larger neighborhoods. They might be a Firewise community, so they've voluntarily taken it upon themselves to reduce their risk, and that can nest in a larger municipality or a county. And in fact, I think it's a good approach, because at the county level, you're not necessarily going to identify all the details at the neighborhood level unless you have a extremely large CWPP. So certainly they can work together at different scales.
That's great, thanks. You want to take a minute to talk about what CPAW is while we're kind of nibbling on this?
Sure. CPAW stands for Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire. It's a program that I co-founded in 2015. We receive funding from the Forest Service, and really essentially what it allows us to do is go out and give our consulting expertise to communities that apply to the program and are looking for advice on how they can improve their planning and regulatory approach to wildfire. So we work with a handful of communities every year across the country. This year we're working with LA County in California, and last year we worked with Redding and Mariposa County in California. So it's been a great opportunity to provide and increase capacity to planning staff and fire staff that often don't have the time or necessarily the expertise to really take this specialized topic on.
Cool. And what's the website for CPAW?
Planningforwildfire.org.
Okay. Thanks, Molly. So Pete, I want to check in on your observation about general plan zoning and wildfire planning, prevention, protection. And just like if you could envision somebody launching into a new general plan update, I'm curious what your advice would be to them as it relates to wildfire planning.
Run as fast as you can the other direction. No, well, let me first start by going back to the conversation that you were just having with Molly about the community wildfire protection plans and how you might integrate that into the general plan. And just to emphasize a couple of things, you talked about, Tim, maybe one thing you would do is include in general plan a policy or a program to develop a CWPP. I think there's another a closing of the loop, if you will, at the other end of that is once you have CWPP prepared in a community or multiple plans, then I think the key land use related objectives and policies from those wildfire protection plans need to find their way back into the safety element of the general plan so that there is kind of a full loop connected there. And then I also want to emphasize and just second what Molly was saying about in relation to the CPAW program, the importance of training staff. And in part, this is the kind of things I think that probably you and I, Tim, did all the time in our roles as planning directors, but you set the standards for how you want staff to approach particular issues. So for example, maybe part of, once you have a community wildfire protection plan in your community, and you're reviewing development projects, you're doing staff reports to your planning commission or to your board of supervisors on projects, maybe you have a section in that staff report that says, here's what's in the community wildfire protection plan, here's how it relates to this project, so on.
Good idea.
So that, and I think that standards like that help engage planners in the kinds of things that we've been talking about so far this morning in terms of being better equipped to help communities live with wildfire.
So Pete, by including it in the staff reports, for example, you create that kind of persistent, continual connection to the issue and keep it on people's mind and give the context to a project to a bigger context. So
right.
I see the value of that.
An expectation then that this is an issue that is important to our community, and we're going to look at projects through this lens with some specific focus.
Nice.
In terms of advice that I would give to somebody who's starting a general plan update, I mean, I think first of all is the recognition of what Jerry Brown said a couple of years ago after the fires here in the North Bay, which is that this is the new abnormal. We are dealing with a new regime, it seems to me, here in California that has been hounding us mercilessly for really the last probably 15 years, going back to the fires down in Southern California earlier in this century. But what I mean by that, at least in part, is that the fire hazard severity zone maps, the 4290 standards, the WUI building code are no longer enough, I think, in terms of planning efforts and approaching planning here. So I would start by establishing relationships with the fire agencies. If you're the planning director, or you're the head of advanced planning in a large agency, you should be on personal terms with the fire chief for your county, or with however your county is set up to deal with fire protection issues. You want to establish those relationships ahead of time, and you want to then use those relationships to help bring that expertise into your long-range planning effort. You want to specifically seek out that expertise, I think, and it's not just necessarily with the fire agencies, But again, going back to people like Molly and the colleagues that she works with, people who are fire ecologists, people who are specialists in fire behavior, both within agencies and outside of agencies, you want to bring them into the process. You know, here in Sonoma County, we had a devastating wildfire a few years back. And then last year we had the largest wildfire we've ever had in the history of the county. Not as damaging as the ones in 2017, but you know, massive in scale. And it seems to me that the county is about to be embark on a major update of its general plan. And my sincere hope is that they, as part of their consulting team that they put together to work on this, that they specifically go out and find expertise in wildfire behavior and management that can provide input to this. So I think then, you know, you need to look at both constraints on the landscape in terms of fire behavior and how it interacts with development, and look at opportunities too, you know, so you're looking at what is the right place for densities out in the wildland urban interface area. What are the right design standards, and most importantly, how do you sustain that over the long term? I think that's one thing that gets overlooked in a lot of these is, you know, we talk about defensible space and you know, fuel reduction and things like that, but that's not a static process at all. You know, we've done some of that in my neighborhood since the fires in 2017, but we also recognize that we're going to have to figure out as a neighborhood a way to fund that and keep that going in the future. And I think that's part of the process for updating the plan as well, because you really rely on that as one of your primary defensive techniques.
Mm-hmm. I think of the, I was kind of blown away with touring the I think it was Coffee Park area in Sonoma County, and the thinking that 101 would be a great fire break, you know, from east to west. And it just seems like with these ember fires and these mega fires, you know, even the thought processes that we use to write the plans are, you know, insufficient. You know,
Yeah.
we're not using enough strategies, information, tools. It's bigger than just, you know, creating an edge or a boundary or something. And, you know, maybe John will want to touch on that too. So, yeah, it's, thank you, Pete. John, from your perspective about, I'm curious, like from your seat, your observation of like a general plan process and how you see the need for fire to engage, connect with that process, influence policies, goals, things like that.
Oh, absolutely. I think having that expertise, like we've all been talking about, you know, each one of us brings something to the table, and bringing those tools from the toolbox with regards to what we see specific to our communities historically, it should play into the general plan going forward. You know, all these plans and everything play into helping communities survive. And not to hint on the fire perspective, but from a planning perspective, when the campfire hit, we had a plan, but the plan went out the window fairly quickly. And so you have to adapt and overcome, and which goes back to what my current role and job is to provide communities and provide neighborhoods the best ability and the tools in their toolbox to survive a wildfire. And so when it comes to creating the general plan or the CWPP, which we're almost done with here in Butte, and from a CAL FIRE perspective, we can bring that to the table. And I think that's what's unique to Butte and also to Sonoma counties, where they do have this SRA presence. And I'm not knocking local governments or anything like that, but there's an enormous amount of resources in the land use planning, especially now within CAL FIRE. And we can bring a lot of information to the table to help communities develop these plans. So if there's local people watching this, you know, reach out to an SRA representative. There's people like me that are at the local level. There's people in land use planning that are at the region level. There's a South and North region in the state of California, and there's people at the Sacramento level. a side note, I was thinking about taking a job as a battalion chief in Sacramento as a subdivision reviewer in the land use planning of CAL FIRE, which I thought was unique, but the travel component kind of got me away from it because, you know, be in San Diego one day and then Siskiyou, the county, the next day. Not that I wouldn't have passion for it, but that's just a story for a different day. But those planning resources are out there. But also planning needs to really start at home as a homeowner and as a neighborhood. Molly hit on it as a FireWise community. We're about to start one in my neighborhood. And what the good thing is, you know, I can bring something to my neighborhood, but I tell other neighborhoods, you know, reach out to your local fire station, or they'll put you in touch with someone who can come out and look at your community. And CAL FIRE also brings to the table defensible space inspectors. You know, they bring that to the table and they can give you hints on all that. But all these tools are there to help communities, because we're in California and people are going to live here. Let's give every community the best chance to survive wildfire.
Great. Thank you. John, I have a few fire behavior questions that had kind of come up in our
Sure.
pre-conversation to this panel. One of them, we have, I think, a rancher in the class, and she was asking about, you know, managing grazing lands, I think in the forest, you know, grazing cattle in the forest, and how is that possibly a solution or helping with the fuels management in the forest?
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any comments on that?
When it comes to the national forest, obviously that's federal responsibility area, and I don't want to overstep my knowledge, but I think that is the hot button topic right now in the state of California, and that they've realized that fuels management is a big thing. And, you know, going back to 1910 and the Great Fires of 1910, that the federal responsibility, you know, our federal counterparts, we'll use that, you know, that the fire was, they called it the 10 a.m. rule, that all fires discovered would be put out by 10 a.m. the next morning. So but we morphed away from that. We see fire as a component, and going back in historical perspective, is fire's always been part of nature. It's been there. So I would implore that person to reach out to their federal counterparts, because once you start putting animals on land, it becomes a touchy issue. But in the state area, we can use grazing animals as a defensible space measure. If people have large plots of land, instead of asking them to disc around their property, we can ask if they have grazing animals that keep their grass 3 inches or less. That is an actual very good tool. And so, yeah, fuels management's the big one these days, and there's different ways we're doing it.
Okay. And then we had another question about fire behavior around, compare, if you will, like a grassland fire to a forest fire.
Oh, well, I can speak to this because I wasn't on the conference call the other day with you, or the Zoom meeting 2 days ago, because we had a grass fire north of Oroville, which surprisingly, with the wind, burned close to 50 acres very quickly. The difference between the fuel models, especially a grass model, is that maybe not right now in May, but when the grass is completely cured here, maybe by this weekend here in the north in Butte County, but up and down the state, is once that grass is cured and a fire does start, it will completely consume that fuel, and most likely will not have the ember cast we've all seen with the destructive fires we've had over the last few years. We've heard about the ember cast. That, excuse me, that grass won't start fires ahead of itself. It's very, very unlikely that grass fires will spot ahead of itself. Once you start getting into the brush model or the timber model, and those fires will cast embers ahead of themselves and start fires. And that we saw that in the campfire, is that you did have the main fire, but that fire was spotting way ahead of itself, and within a few minutes was another 50 to 100 acres. And I think that's trying to convey that message. And going back to what we've been talking about, is people, and it's nothing against them because we're the experts, but people think that a fire front just comes at them. It's not. It is throwing you might see the fire a couple miles away, and I'll use the Cedar Fire in San Diego in 2003. People went to bed that night. The fire was 14 miles away. And in a couple hours, they were woken up by smoke. And same with the campfires. That fire got spotted ahead of itself and started new fires. So it grew exponentially aside from the actual fire front. So when you get into those brush and timber models, you're going to start having the ember cast or spotting ahead of itself, which makes it a much more dangerous fire.
Great, thank you. And then one more question just about behavior. Actually, somebody else might be asking a question. Talk about slope and what slope does to fire.
Sure. There's three factors that contribute to fire spread: fuel, weather, and topography. And on a topographical driven fire, it's just heat rises. So if you have a fire that starts at the bottom of a drainage or at the bottom of a hillside, it will grow faster because heat likes to go uphill, but it also treat those fuels by drying those fuels out ahead of itself. So those fuels above the fire will become drier and much more receptible to spotting. So it's just like putting your hand over the top of a stove. You know, the flame's down here, but up here you can still feel the heat. So that heat, and then all of a sudden with that heat rising, it brings air in behind it and grows to the spread. So now you have a topographical driven fire, and the fire's starting to create its own weather. So it's bringing in winds, and that fire grows, and depending on the fuel model, of course, that fire can grow very, very fast, unlike lighting it on a flat piece of ground with no wind behind it.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's very
I
helpful.
think, Tim,
Go ahead,
part I
Mike.
would add on the planning side is that working with fire behavior experts like John helps people probably like Pete and myself and you understand what the implications are of where we site development on a slope, and what the setbacks would need to be. You know, often we see a lot of conflicts where we work with communities that say we want to preserve the visual character of our community, and so we want you to essentially hide yourselves in the trees on the slope so that this still looks like a beautiful mountainside. So, you know, we've had a lot of challenges in communities where there's hillside preservation combined with preserving the scenic character of an area and trying to look at ways you can integrate fire behavior concepts into the planning process. So you're taking a really strategic approach to, if you're going to allow development on the hillside, what does that need to look like? And there will have to be some trade-offs in terms of, you may not get everything you want, but you have to look at the safety.
Right, thank you. You know, Pete,
And if I could, sorry, Tim, if I could just follow up, I'm currently dealing with that a specific issue right now. There's so many factors, and I'm not going to get into it. Excuse me. But the fire safe regs are based off average wildfire conditions, which is a very broad brush term, because fires, like Pete said about something else, fire's not static. Fire's its own animal. It does all kinds of, so that's where we do come into something. And I understand that we could apply average wildfire conditions, but I'm going to go out to a house or a property and go, maybe you want to put, I know there's 30-foot setbacks, but it probably behoove you to increase your setbacks or get some other same practical effect. So just to touch on what Molly's saying, is that's where the planning, and we would come into it, because we can say, well, in 2008, I fought a fire here, ma'am, and this is what that fire has traditionally done, and it would behoove you to do something else. And I get the views and I get all that, but we want to give your house the best chance to survive.
Cool, thank you. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit, or actually take it a little bit deeper into the weeds, I guess. Okay, so let's say that we have all these documents, plans completed, they're current. They're not just sitting on the shelf. We have staff that understand these plans. We're using them. We're out implementing the plans. And I think about the world that we live in, okay, and the processes that we have to address in our departments at the county level. And I think of the different kinds of development. And I think of there being really 3 different kinds of development that occur that may impact or be impacted by wildfire. So, and I'd like to take them one at a time. The first one, the 3 are new discretionary development, new ministerial development, and existing development. And we'll define what these are. So what strategies would we use to address each of these? And so we'll start with new discretionary development. These are projects that are use permits, so conditional uses on properties that are allowed by code, by the zoning ordinance. These are subdivisions of properties, parcel maps, so splitting properties for residential development typically, specific plans, which is a tool for a larger master planning approach for having smart growth plans, which mean you have a lot of the services, commercial and residential services in close proximity, intended to provide a way to get services with less travel, less pollution, less vehicle miles traveled, all that. And so I want to talk about kind of your observations about how we do things with processing discretionary permits projects, and what ideas you have for dealing with discretionary projects in the WUI. So Pete, if you could take a run at this first.
Sure. I think a couple things come to mind. One is to go back to something that the land use attorney sage Dan Curtin used to say as part of his presentations is, in California, development is a privilege, not a right. And so with discretionary, and that's particularly true with new discretionary development, where as part of the process for approving that development, the local agency has to make certain findings that the development is going to be safe, that it's going to be consistent with the general plan, that it is compatible with the neighborhood. There's a variety of different ways that happens throughout the process. So you have to start asking these fundamental questions when you're developing in the WUI area, particularly when you're developing in the very high fire hazard severity zones. Is this the right place? Can you actually adequately protect this development in this area? Are there really sufficient mitigations? And it's a subtle difference, I think, between asking the question of, given this development here, is this the best we can do? Or should this development go here? So I think this is an area where, particularly given that we're in this new abnormal in California, we've seen devastating wildfires, we have to up our game a bit and start asking those really fundamental questions about this. And then I would also just to touch back to what we've talked about several times now so far this morning, is the need to bring in specific expertise on fire behavior and fire management as part of that analysis.
Okay. So
I'll leave it there, see where else we want to go.
Okay. So maybe Pete and John, you too, Molly, if you would like to just clarify and do a little definition for us about the very high and very high fire severity zones, the WUI, just kind of unjumble those terms for us a little bit. John, maybe you could do that.
Yeah, I mean, the state of California and land use planners, and Molly might have the more expertise background on how they determine and what factors go into determining that. I'm not quite well versed in what criteria or data they use to say, well, on this side of the street it's high severity zone and over here it's very high. I'm sure there's fire history and fuel models and all that kind of stuff. But I would like her, if she knows, to touch on that, because I just don't know what data's inputted, and then all of a sudden, well, that place is all of a sudden very high fire severity.
So before I ask Molly, I want to just check in, John. So there's also the LRA, the SRA. So clarify that and how that relates to very high fire hazard zones and all that. So what is the SRA and LRA?
SRA is state responsibility area, and LRA is local responsibility area. And so those, and then there's FRA, which is federal responsibility areas. So that's who has jurisdictional authority for land management over those areas. However, LRA, or local responsibility areas, can adopt, and this is kind of where we ran into an issue with the town of Paradise pre-Camp Fire, is that they were surrounded by very high fire severity zone. And I don't want to speak too bluntly, but they just didn't want to incorporate that determination for their community, even though they were surrounded by it for a myriad of reasons. But that's where it lands. We don't really, from a state perspective or maps for that point, determine what a fire hazard severity zone is in the LRA. It'll just say LRA from a lot of the maps that we produce.
Okay, so Molly, help us unjumble this very high and high fire hazard severity zones if you can.
So fire hazard severity zones are geographical areas that are designated pursuant to the California Public Resources Codes. I think it's sections 4201 through 4204, and they're classified as very high, high, or moderate in state responsibility areas or local agency very high fire hazard severity zones. Suffice it to say, it's a geographical designation that is conducted by the state. The WUI area is a little bit, or WUIs, I should say, is a little bit of more of a slippery slope because, you know, I was just doing some research for LA County recently, and in their locally adopted building code, they have the wildland urban interface fire area also defined very similarly to a fire hazard severity zone. However, you may see other ways that communities define their WUI, and this depends on how they've delineated what constitutes not necessarily the wildfire hazard, but the other components of a WUI. So, for example, other development that they're concerned about. You know, they're looking beyond what's the hazard as opposed to what's in this area that we may want to consider. So, you know, I would encourage anyone that has questions, if they're working specifically in a community, to look to see if their community has adopted a WUI definition that pertains, it may be in their community wildfire protection plan, it could be in their general plan, could be in both. Sometimes we see different definitions depending on the plan. I will point out, though, this is a really, it's a topic you could talk about for a long time, because where there are spatial definitions of the WUI, one of the things that we discussed at length in our PAS report was, what does the WUI really mean for a planner, and how should they understand it? And so what we said, I'll just read it to you here, is the WUI in the context of this report refers to any developed area where conditions affecting the combustibility of natural and cultivated vegetation, which is your wildland fuels, and structures or infrastructure, which is your built fuels, allows for the ignition and spread of fire through this combined fuel complex. And so essentially what we're saying is, when you're thinking about the WUI, you consider the built environment and the natural environment, because I think there's this, there's this kind of clean way of trying to look at things that they're neatly mapped on. If you're in or out of a zone, you just will or won't see fire sometimes. And we recognize that our definition was not as simplistic, but we wanted to get at the dynamics of fire, and that there are these places that you say, well, we weren't in the WUI, I don't know how we burned. Well, you had the conditions that allowed for that spread of fire to occur, and there's a reason why this area burned. And so we really wanted to try and get that thinking into planners' heads, that it's, sometimes to look beyond, well, our downtown wasn't mapped in the WUI. Why did we have a fire here? Or how did the fire get here? Well, because, there were conditions that allowed for that spread of fire.
Cool. I think of our...
And just
go ahead, Pete.
To add on to that a little bit, I think when I read the PAS report, I was really kind of taken aback by how broad and complex, like Molly said, how broad the WUI really is. And so I think it's important to note that there's a distinction between the regulatory WUI, if you will, where the WUI building codes apply, where other regulations may apply, and really from a fire ecology or fire behavior standpoint, where is the WUI in your community? And the latter is really going to be much larger than the former in most instances, it seems.
Yeah. I think of our general plan of Butte County, when we wrote it, we ended up with exhibits. We have one exhibit for the SRA, LRA, FRA. That's one map that shows a spatial, picture of what those boundaries are. Those are service response areas. Then we have a separate map that shows, exhibit that shows the fire hazard severity zones. And, I always wanted them to be coterminous. And they didn't quite work like that because life doesn't work like that. And then the WUI, you throw, like if we had a WUI exhibit, it would look different. And so, depending on what your definitions were. So, do you apply it to this semi-urban area or not, and things like that. So I think it's just good to be aware of how these terms and factors interact and interplay with each other. So that was a good question. Thank you for that.
One thing I'll add too, Tim, because I think this is also something that can be confusing, is sometimes, this isn't always the case, and we encourage communities to think beyond this, but sometimes the WUI reflects where development exists today. It's like, well, sometimes it's not a WUI until you develop something, and then there is that mix of the built and built and natural environment. So some people say, well, this whole area is in the WUI, but I'm not building on the map. So I know that's a nuance, but I'm trying to encourage planners to think about where you anticipate future development and what that dynamic would look like.
Yeah, it's not a WUI till you put the houses there.
Well, when that subdivision does occur. So you can't ignore the fire hazard severity zones or what the hazard information also tells us. And I think, Pete sort of touched on this, but looking at those two tools together is really important.
Okay, we're nibbling on this, so this is great. Let's talk about ministerial permits. So this is now what we want to talk about. What's the role and what should be the role of the various departments in addressing new building on existing parcels. So we're not creating new parcels and adding houses. We're actually adding houses to existing parcels. So we have certain codes that address that. And John, maybe you want to start with this, talk about your role with defensible space and 429091 and how that affects your review of new building permits. So you're muted. So yeah.
So yeah, that's a great question, because to hint back towards what I was talking about, I'm dealing with a current issue of someone who wants to rebuild versus someone who 4 houses down has a blank canvas. Kind of the stance from the fire department perspective and the county perspective is that we're going to allow people to build in their same footprint, but use mitigating factors if setbacks or defensible space come into question, because there's all kinds of other you can harden the landscape, the Chapter 7A building materials. I could go down that road. But I also, when someone has a blank canvas, I'm much more strict with regards to those the setbacks. That's just one component, is that, hey, you have a blank canvas, and I understand that maybe you want to look that way, but to meet the setbacks from all property lines and other buildings, you're going to you have the ability to change that right now. And we're much more stricter in our office with someone. I understand that parcels are there, but if they want to build, again, I always hint, we're trying to give you all the tools to give your house and your property the best chance of surviving a wildfire impacting your area or your house specifically. So I'm much more strict when people have a blank canvas and can redo their plans if there's not a building footprint already there.
In that 1961 fire video, that point was made really clearly, that when a fire engine shows up, to fight fire in a neighborhood, that moment of looking at the houses and saying, which one are we going to have the best chance of protecting? And
well, I can hint towards that, because in my training and when I used to be on an engine and you'd go out and do structure protection, you would look at what the property owner has done. First and foremost, has he created his defensible space? Has he provided a good egress and ingress into his property? I'm not going to put myself or my crew in a position to get hurt if they haven't maintained their yard. We're going to skip it and go to the next house. And after the campfire, I was assigned as damage inspector. And when I did my initial training for that, and that's where we go out and we look at everybody's property and we try to determine what kind of building construction, what kind of defensible space. And one of the key ones is, was there firefighter intervention? Because when I initially took this training for damage inspection, one of the unique things that came out of it, houses during the, ever since the Bowles fire in 2013 up in Weed, California, that the damage inspection is all done on the collector app. There's 5 categories that homes are put in. Destroyed, major damage, moderate damage, little to no damage, or not affected. And of those 3 small categories, and the reason they were in those categories, I want to say was 70% was due to firefighter intervention. So by property owners and by code and by planning, giving a community and a home the best chance, and specifically when we're able to get there, unlike the wine country fires in 2017 and the Camp Fire in 2018, which life safety was the primary role and responsibility of everybody, that we want to go do structure protection. We want to protect property. So having all those components in place helps us out with that.
So if you could, John, touch a little bit further on defensible space. There's like a 30-foot requirement or setback, some of that?
And we're running into that with right now because the 2020 fire safe regs just came out, and it used to be 1 acre or smaller. You did not have to meet the 30-foot setback. Now, 2020 has said all properties have to meet the 30-foot setback from all sides or the center of the road. So as you know, Tim, up in Magalia and some of these other communities, the lots are very, very small. And so they can't meet that 30-foot setback. Now there's a trigger in place, which they can ask for an exception to the standard, and showing same practical effect and mitigating factors. And that's kind of what we're doing with those properties. But hitting back to it, defensible space is one of those components, and I think a very big one, especially if firefighters are showing up to defend your home. We're going to look at, okay, they've cut the manzanita down or they've removed the brush 100 feet away from their house. They've given a great chance to help us protect the house. We're going to make a stand right here. So that's very, very big going forward.
Good, thank you. Okay. Pete, do you want to give kind of like your experience with processing, new ministerial permits and what you've interacted with and some of the problems that may have come your way that you've had to address and solve?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize what ministerial permits are. They're permits where the answer to approval or not approval is a binary question. It meets standards or it doesn't meet standards, right? And so successful processing or successful implementation of ministerial permits means having the right standards in place. And in some areas, I think that we're doing a good job with that. In other areas, not such a good job with it. I'm glad to hear what John was saying about kind of the ratcheting up of the requirements with the new 2020 fire safe regulations, because, just because you've got a smaller parcel, it's unfortunate, but it doesn't, the fire hazard magnitude there is something that you still need to deal with and be able to address from a defensibility standpoint. And so I think that there's an opportunity with ministerial permits to, again, engage with your local fire protection agencies and with CAL FIRE if they're a factor in your community, and sit down with them and look at the standards that you apply to a ministerial permit and ask yourselves, are these enough? Are these sufficient in these areas? Where should we be looking at increasing our standards or changing our standards in some way? Community wildfire protection plans, I think, are another good venue, if you will, for kind of teasing out those requirements and making sure that you're matching your regulatory regime to what the landscape calls for. But again, I'll go back to something that I said with regard to discretionary development and with regard to general plan updates. There's a maintenance factor in all this, and that I'm sure John can testify to. You could build a new house and you have beautiful defensible space. You come back in 5 years and you've got a lot of brush overgrown and whatnot. So there's got to be a mechanism for maintaining it over time.
That's where, like John says, give the firefighters a chance to save your house.
Exactly.
Well, just to tag on to that really quick, and we could have a whole nother conversation about it, is the mechanism in place to tell people to maintain their property. We do have steps in place to say, hey, you got to keep your defensible space, and we can get down to where our prevention officers, and I'm talking specifically in the SRA, that they can cite the person. But what is the district attorney going to do? What mechanisms are in place? And I grew up in LA before I came up north, and I always bring this up to our local jurisdictions, is that my parents in LA City, they were classified, I don't know what kind of zone it was back then, they were classified in a WUI, we'll just use that term. And they got a notice every January, cut your stuff down, or guess what, in a month, people are gonna show up and do it, and you're getting a bill. There was no ifs, ands, and buts about it. Now it's harder in rural counties like Sonoma or Butte or some of these other ones to do that and get the resources to go out and do it. But I agree that we need, with Pete, we need a mechanism in place to say, well, my neighbor's not doing their defensible space. I'm doing mine, but we need someone to go in and make them do theirs, because they're jeopardizing my house and their property and the neighborhood's property. So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox with that, but we do need some kind of, from the state or local jurisdictions, to really understand the implications of what Molly described, is that the WUI is not only organic fuel, but once it gets into homes, you have an urban firestorm. And so we need people to maintain that, and we need a mechanism in place for people to take it seriously.
Thanks.
One of the things I might add to, sorry, Tim, can I add something here as a suggestion? Early in my wildfire planning career, I got the opportunity to become a home DSpace assessor. And I was very intimidated by it, because I remember saying, I'm not a firefighter, I don't know how to do this, but I feel like I need to learn. So I shadowed many people. I was working here in Boulder County, who has developed a very robust parcel level assessment program that's integrated into their land use department and their review process. And one of the things as a independent consultant that I learned, though, was from the county, and through that process, was the value of understanding all of the dynamics in that defensible space area on a property and on the home and structure itself. And I want to encourage everyone, regardless of whether you're a planner or what your background is, that to the extent that you can, at a minimum, go out, ask to go on a ride along with the CAL FIRE expert, if they're allowed to do that. But shadow someone that can really point these different features out, because it's not only how can you improve safety for first responders and the homeowner, but how can this home survive without potential intervention if there isn't any? And I think seeing all of these features fitting together, and that really shaped my career, and it gave me a lot of confidence in talking about these features later on at that site-specific scale. And there's absolutely no reason that you don't have to be a trained fire expert to at least gain enough knowledge to understand those dynamics. And then, we see that a lot with the planners we work with. They say, well, I don't know how to do this. It's like, well, you don't have to become the world's best expert, but there are definitely a lot of resources to help you understand these dynamics. And then it empowers them to make those kinds of counter level decisions when they're reviewing, or what Pete was talking about with putting in standards that say, okay, well, you can meet these specific standards. And then when there does require more discretionary review, then it can go to the next level. But I guess I want to encourage everyone that this is a process that sometimes can seem quite intimidating, but it's very important and also approachable, and there are many good resources.
Great, thank you. I'm getting some good questions in. I want to pitch to the group here. One question from John is, have you seen conflicts between required fuel clearance areas and protections for riparian buffers best addressed? So some of this push and pull of various requirements. And Pete or John, Molly, have you guys experienced any of that in your work?
Not specifically, but I would suggest, depending on where it's at, that, we have resources, again, that, we have our foresters that can go out and address this. I don't think CAL FIRE has many ecologists or biologists, but I'm sure if the forester couldn't answer those questions with protected areas or vegetation conflict, he at least could point you in the right direction. And each CAL FIRE unit, there's 21 units, has a forester assigned to them. And so I would suggest you reach out to that. If you have an issue, call me. I'll point you in the right direction of a forester, because we have urban foresters too, which can point you in the right direction.
Great. Anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I would just add that I think that's a situation where it's important to have a biologist involved, somebody with some expertise as it relates to the particular values that are there in the riparian corridor. And it's important to remember that defensible space doesn't mean clear cutting necessarily, right, John? And so you have to look at this balance of what kind of fuel modifications are really necessary on the site and what kind of fuel modifications can the riparian resource tolerate relatively well, because they can be kind of resilient in many respects as well. But it really depends on the nature of the riparian area.
I would reach out to Fish and Wildlife. They could help with that. And to hint on what Pete's talking about, you're exactly right. I do see people who clear cut, but usually it's around a grass model. But what we're trying to prevent is, from that fire going from a grass model to a brush model to your trees. We want to take away those ladder fuels, and then you want to take away brush to brush transition also. So thinning fuels is the defensible space area that we want, not clear cutting. I think that's a very good point by Pete when we ask for defensible space.
So here's a really good, dangerous question that someone's asking, that John's asking about. Does CAL FIRE work directly with CDFW, Fish and Wildlife, to identify performance standards for riparian areas? So really you're asking, are two state agencies talking to each other? So is that possible, John? Tell us.
Absolutely, it's possible. The state works well with everybody. No, especially with fuel modification projects like we've been talking about, which is the hot topic up and down the state, that if we bring in our foresters, we bring in our archaeologists. If we are going to impact a riparian area, I don't know if it would specifically be Fish and Wildlife, but our pre-fire engineering department probably has those contacts. And those, I see it's a pretty big topic and they want an answer that I can reach out, or this person can reach out to their pre-fire engineering person and find, hey, who is the person to talk to with regards to riparian areas or that defensible space or butting up to a riparian area.
Yeah, this sounds like
no,
we a whole other class.
Sure, we absolutely, yeah, because if we actually have an active fire, we will acknowledge it on the radio or make the notification that the fire is going to impact the riparian area. Okay. And so, but where it goes from there, I'm unsure of. But okay. Absolutely, we talk to Fish and Wildlife all the time.
All right, good to hear. We're happy to hear that. So let's move on. I want to talk about existing development and, as I call it, legacy development, lands that were developed in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, which may be the toughest nut to crack. John, you touched on it about enforcing defensible space requirements on existing properties. I had a question earlier, so I want to touch on this first. before we get to defensible space and what we do about the existing neighborhoods, about the circulation. And circulation is a huge issue with these long dead-end roads that were installed, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 100, whatever years ago, that we have a lot of people living down the end of these dead-end roads. And so we think that we're addressing it with new development, like in our discretionary projects, by requiring secondary access or emergency access of some kind. John, could you touch a little bit about your observations about the history of dead-end roads in existing communities and kind of what the current fire thinking is around that?
I saw history of private dead-end roads that I never want to see again walking through the town of Paradise. And I can't speak to their historical reasoning why, but I would start my damage inspection and think, oh, this is a private driveway, and go down and find 35 homes down there with only one way in and one way out of a no more than 10-foot wide road. And I can't speak directly to what the town's going to do to address that, but I think it's imperative in the fire realm, because we talk about it in structure fires, to have two ways out. And it's imperative with planning and subdivision maps or parcel maps that we condition that, and we look at potentially the length of cul-de-sac and other factors, that you guys really need to have two ways out. If you're going to have a dead-end road, you need to meet the fire safe regulations or the improvement standards to allow potentially resources getting in and people getting out. And I think we really ran into that issue in Paradise, is that you had an enormous amount of private roads where we might be trying to get resources in and people are getting out. So you can only imagine what's going to happen. There's no way to go to the left or to the right. So it's absolutely going forward that community development and subdivision development has two ways out. I'm a big one. I haven't had many subdivision maps come across of new development yet, but we absolutely do hit on it when it does.
Okay. Pete, any observations about, can you envision a project to address a community circulation issue on existing dead-end roads?
Well, it's really tough for all the reasons that John just described. In addition, you've got tremendous fairness issues. So you have a road like, let's say it's the one that John was describing, where you've got 35 lots that are served by a 10-foot access road. Totally inadequate. Totally, it's not safe. But what do you say to the last 2, 3, 4, 5 people that are going to develop at the end of that road who have existing parcels down there? I think that may be one of the things that needs to shift in our approach to these things, and there may be some shifts going on right now at the Board of Forestry in terms of how they're looking at that. The fire safe regulations, 4290 and 4291, which are the road standards among other things, have not been applied to existing roads in the past. And what we may be seeing a shift in the Board of Forestry to say it does apply to existing roads. So if you're building a house on a dead end road, on a road that is seriously substandard, maybe you can't do that unless that road can be brought up to some sort of nominal standards with turnouts or something like that. But obviously when you get into that, you start getting into, like I said, tremendous fairness issues and a huge cost issue. So you've got the last person to develop on the road is now all of a sudden responsible for having to upgrade the entire road, which is, there's going to be some lawsuits over that.
So, John, I'm wondering if you could touch on, the same practical effect concept, because I can picture this dead end road we're talking about with 35 homes, or maybe the last home to be built is at the end of the road. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's a legal parcel. They have, well, I guess, do they have legal access? Yes, they have legal access. Is it safe access? That's another question. But I'm wondering, with building materials, is that a factor in same practical effect in terms of your observation or perspective of fighting a fire around that home? if it's maybe you can't even get down the road, I guess, to fight the fire would be the other issue. But we pick it up on the building side and say, okay, it can't have wood siding. All the new code is going to have to be in place to, make it really fire safe is kind of what I'm trying to get to. So John, how do you address that in the real world on existing structures? Like, let's even, like you talk about applying standards to new construction. Well, what about even remodels and additions? Does that trigger, us to relook at the safety of that property?
Absolutely, and I hate to keep hinting back to it, but we're dealing with that right now. A house that cannot meet the property setbacks, we have conditioned that project with the same practical effect. We just sent it back to, we're not we're not plan makers. We don't design homes, but we can give suggestions of what we see. And we can provide resources, not only the fire safe regulations, but California Building Code, Chapter 7A, and the Office of State Fire Marshal Buildings Materials List. There's enormous amount of code interpretations and information bulletins that come out all the time. The residential code has R337, materials and construction methods for wildfire exposure. So if we see something, we'll absolutely point it out to a property owner to get that same practical effect. And again, it's what I've run into is that it's so ingrained in people's minds, and no fault of their own, because I was there at this fire, that everything goes back to the campfire. What can we do to not make my house burn down if campfire comes again? And it's like, well, I don't want the campfire, not to get into that because it's another 2-hour discussion, but we try to base it off average conditions. So conditioning a project and putting these tools out for someone, saying, hey, and doing site visits. Let me hit on that. We are more than happy to come out to a property and look at their property, look at their plan review, and give suggestions and provide materials so people, I didn't know about that I can have the same practical effect to give my house the best chance.
So John, just to clarify, on a rebuild
Mm-hmm.
or a campfire home that was burned down on one of these narrow, steep roads, what are you doing?
On the narrow, and usually that's up in the Concal Magalia area. Magalia has, probably not a lot of people are familiar with it. It has a very good public road structure. They do have very wide roads that allow ingress and egress. When we get up into the more rural areas like Concal and Jarbo Gap, the same practical effect is, the width of road. Not only the width of road, but removing the vegetation to the left and to the right. So if you have to evacuate or we have to get in and fire's impacting that area, there's a larger buffer. It might not be the road, but there's going to be a larger buffer of fuel taken away. Turnouts, so someone can get out of our way or we can get out of their way. We absolutely do look at the length of driveway, access. They have to trim those fuels. That's actually a requirement when we go out and do a rebuild, that not only vertically, but horizontally, they need to remove fuel from their ingress and egress.
Thank you. That's helpful. Mm-hmm. And then I was curious, what do you guys do in Butte County, John, for, like, if I call, like, I've done all this defensible space work on my property, my existing property, and my neighbors are just overgrown. What's the program?
Well, if you're in the state responsibility area, we'll do LE 100 inspections, and we'll give notice, and we'll give a secondary notice. But going back to that mechanism, what mechanism do we have in place to force someone in the state responsibility area to cut their stuff down? So we don't really have that in place. We can cite, but where it goes from there, we're very unsure of, because here in Butte County, we could probably cite an enormous amount of people. So we try to tell landowners to contact your neighbor, or go over there and cut some of their stuff back. We try to find other suggestions to mitigate that hazard, but it's very, very hard until we can get a mechanism in place.
one of our students says that they have adopted a local ordinance that requires a resident to abate the property in 14 days, or they'll send a crew out and abate it for them, and they'll lien the property.
Right.
So
That's
that's
kind of
out
the,
there in some jurisdictions, I guess.
I know it was in LA City, and I try to preach it here in Butte County, because right now is weed abatement time. It's just having a mechanism that we can do, and that's a great one, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like a real potential legal, pitfall to get into with the debate about same practical effect. Okay,
So the
so
hard part that we've encountered elsewhere is if you don't allow homeowners to rebuild because there's no way that they can meet the conditions, then you're getting into the takings issue. You're just telling someone you simply can't rebuild because you can't do these things that are out of your control. So it does get into a very, I'm not a lawyer, but we've experienced or we've witnessed these issues where, practically speaking, it's been very difficult. I can't think of one example where we found communities who can tell homeowners you can't rebuild, or they weren't willing to say that,
right.
because it
That's
gets you into a
pretty tough conversation.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, I want to talk, Pete, a little bit about your personal experience and your professional experience with the North Bay fires of 2017.
Sure. Always happy to remember that. It's very
sorry.
It was really an overwhelming experience. Between the lack of warning and the lack of intelligence about what was going on, it was really kind of a nightmare scenario. So when I went to bed that night, about 10 o'clock, there was almost no wind, no smoke in the air, anything like that. Woke up about 2.5 hours later with just choking smoke all over the place. And so I called our local fire agency, which they have a station that's probably about a mile as the crow flies from our house. And they said, well, yeah, there's a fire over there in Kenwood. You don't need to worry about it. We don't think it's going to get up to your area, you can go back to bed. And so we watched the fire for a little while, decided that we were not comfortable staying there. We decided to evacuate to my mother-in-law's house, who lives down in Santa Rosa. Well, it turned out that she was in the mobile home park that was largely destroyed by the Tubbs fire. So our home was, and our neighborhood was impacted by the Nuns fire. There were several fires that started at the same time. We had no idea that was going on. We had no idea that there were multiple fires going on at the same time in Sonoma County. So we got down in time to get grandma out of her house and then found someplace else to go. So it was a pretty hairy experience that night, but really, as it relates to the community, it was a staggering blow. Everybody I knew was affected in one way or another. There were I think it was 5,300 homes that were lost in Sonoma County virtually overnight. And between, everybody was either directly affected by that, had somebody staying with them, knew somebody who had lost their house, or knew multiple people who had lost their home. It really did affect the entire community. And it was way beyond the worst case scenario. I had a lot of, after the fire, conversations with fire chiefs who would say something along the lines of, well, we would always try to plan for the worst case scenario, and we would train for it and exercise for it. This was way beyond that. In part, there were kind of two phenomena that occurred there. One is areas that were not thought to be vulnerable were just devastated. You mentioned Coffey Park earlier. Tim, this is an area in the city of Santa Rosa that's about as conventional a 1980s residential subdivision as you could possibly find. Nobody in their right mind would have thought that it was a wildfire hazard area before the fire came. But the fire, as you said, crossed 6 lanes of Highway 101, went into Coffey Park, and ended up burning 1,400 houses in that area, just in this sort of scorched earth fashion. Then I started thinking about what are the lessons here about this, and that's when my thinking really started to evolve. around some of the things we've talked about already in terms of improved planning for wildfire resilience in our communities. But I also started looking into how we had gotten to where we were. And it wasn't like the communities here in our county had not paid attention to this. The city of Santa Rosa had done a couple of different community wildfire protection plans. They've done analyses of the entire WUI area that kind of surrounded the east side of the city. And they were remarkably prescient in that they identified all of the areas that were vulnerable to wildfire. So all of the areas that were identified in these, virtually all of them that were identified in these community wildfire plans were impacted by the fires that night. But what these plans didn't envision was all of this going up at once. And that's actually what happened. You know, you talked in terms of, well, if you had a fire over here in this part of town, it could impact, you know, maybe 50 homes or 100 homes or something like this. But it didn't envision a fire happening here and one over here and one over here, and kind of the devastating magnitude of it. So, you know, it really did, I think, bring home a couple of things for me. One is that we are in this new abnormal situation where we have firestorms threatening our communities that we had not imagined before. We really had kind of a failure of imagination. And then, like I have said several times already, you know, a need to do a better job, not only with our long range, more visionary planning, but with our current planning efforts that look at new development.
Thank you. Wow. And fortunately, you've rebuilt?
We've rebuilt, yes.
All right.
We have plenty of defensible space.
John would be proud.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to touch on a couple of questions that we've gotten in. Molly, questions come in about how widespread is the adoption of CWPPs been in California? What are the barriers to adoption, funding, capacity, politics? What are you hearing?
Yeah, and John may want to chime in on this too, but CWPP adoption is not uniform across the state. And this is true of any state that I've worked in. There are some states that encourage them more than others, and I think give a little bit more guidance. I think the land use planning program does, from what I've seen, and John, you know, they've done a really great job in promoting the benefits and value of CWPPs. I think some of the limitations, though, that I see is time. I think it was listed all of the above. Funding, capacity. I'm not sure politics is so much of a role. In fact, excuse me, some of what we see is that communities will opt to do a CWPP because it doesn't hold them accountable to actually implementing anything, as opposed to, you know, codes and standards, or it's like, oh, we're committed to this, we adopted this. So even if it's adopted, it's still a plan, I guess is my point. I'm not sure if that's fully answering Alan's question, but, you know, and even of those communities that have adopted CWPPs as a plan, what we encourage is that they get adopted or attached to the local hazard mitigation plan, so it gets on a regular update cycle and it's really linked into something. Also, we say, you know, the local hazard mitigation plan opens up a door of more funding. I'm sure many of the students are familiar with this already, but creating mechanisms that you can leverage and then to access more funding is a key point, because often we see communities may have a great CWPP, but if they don't have any way to fund or pursue funding for the actions that they've required or that they've proposed, it's very difficult to gain traction, and it kind of, I think it's frustrating for a lot of the people.
Do you know how many approximately planned CWPPs we have in California? Any idea? John, maybe you know?
It falls in the pre-fire engineering shop because we're updating ours. I thought I had a list. There's several out there from local jurisdictions and, you know, county jurisdictions, but I don't have the number specifically. I'm trying to find where I found how many there are, but I can't find it right now.
Okay, well, maybe I can follow up afterwards with people after you find that. Kind of getting, got my sights, we got about 20 more minutes. There's a good point brought up, Tom brought up a point about the takings issue that was raised earlier. I think Molly raised it, that we have to be careful when of imposing standards, essentially saying you can't rebuild on your property for this or that reason. He kind of points out, we have land use authority. So if we have codes and standards we adopt, and that it may be a little fuzzier that it's a taking, I think is Tom's point on a rebuilding situation. It's a it's a really interesting conversation I had with the town manager of Paradise, and when the dust settled a little bit, and it was still pretty early, this was in December, I started the conversation with her about, are you going to rebuild Paradise, or is there a chance to replan Paradise? And it's just, I think conceptually it sounds great to replan, and certainly you want to make it more fire resilient than it was before, more fire safe in the future. It's a challenge in that there's such emotion involved with people wanting to get their property cleaned and get back in and rebuild. In my estimation, a third of the people were going gangbusters on getting back on their property with a temporary dwelling unit and then into a permanent rebuilt structure. A third were in the no way am I ever going back, I'm leaving the area. And a third were I don't know, kind of like deer in the headlights. So it's an amazing experience to try to make communities more fire safe after they've endured fire. We had another question about abatement programs certainly have promise, but also require the cost of abatement to be borne by the jurisdiction taking the action. Is state funding available for local abatement programs? What sources or mechanisms are available or recommend? So I think this is sort of a cash flow question. If you do the abatement, you're upfronting the cost and you're kind of going on some reimbursement, whether it's a lien on the property or that's probably what we're looking at. John, any comment?
For the abatement programs?
Yeah.
For the abatement programs, the hazard, is follow up and mechanisms in place to make people do it. That's, we have a pretty robust prevention officer department, but it's just where it goes from the next level once we tell someone to abate a hazard. And that's where we run into our roadblocks, is that our fire chief needs to really get together, and I'm specifically talking about Butte, getting together and saying, hey, people are concerned. I mean, whether you live in South Butte County or in the Camp Fire footprint, people are concerned. And if you go up into the town of Paradise and surrounding, the field's back. It's almost back, and not necessarily the timber model, but it's back, and it needs to be taken seriously on how we're going to enforce that. And I know we're working very diligently here in Butte. It's the follow up and really making people understand it.
So kind of a general plan question, Pete, I think for us about, I know Butte County's general plan promoted growth in the urban areas. And, we didn't add a new subdivision in the Paradise area after the general plan. Because it's a secondary access issue, as well as, we just zoned it a certain way that did not allow for new subdivision. So I'm just curious about your thoughts of how we balance people wanting to live in the beautiful wildland urban interface with also promoting smart growth, urban compact development, that push and pull. So talk a little bit about that, Pete.
Sonoma County's planning approach is very similar to Butte County's. We have kind of a long history of city-centered growth. So like you, we have not seen very many subdivisions out of the rural areas of the county. It's really more these existing subdivisions, the existing development that are the issue there. Speaking to the issue of maintenance and funding and whatnot, I think that is really the major obstacle, is finding funding for these things. It might be a good time to mention SB 182, which is pending in the legislature right now. And if this is a topic that is of interest to your students, I would definitely go and look at SB 182, because it would, to a very large extent, overhaul how fire hazard mitigation occurs through the planning process in California. One of the requirements in there would be in the very high fire hazard severity zones that new developments of a certain size would have to show not only that they have established defensible space and met all the other requirements there, but that they have put a in perpetuity funding mechanism in place to fund ongoing maintenance of that. And I think that for new developments going forward, that's absolutely what you're going to have to do. For existing developments, it's going to be really more a matter of finding grant monies and state support for this. Unfortunately, with the state's now $54 billion hole in its budget due to the coronavirus this year, I don't see much hope for that coming from the state. But there are other sources of money too. So, like, just for an example, in my own neighborhood here, we've really gotten organized about this. We've become a FireWise community. We've formed a 501c3 to do vegetation management in our neighborhood, and we got a grant for I think it was around $90,000 from PG&E actually to do vegetation management in our neighborhood, in addition to the vegetation management that PG&E has been doing directly around their lines. So those are the kinds of efforts that it's going to take. There at this point, there is really not enough money, I think, out there to do this.
Thank you. Great answer. Okay. John, I want to just give you a few minutes to talk about the campfire.
No.
Yes, you were in it. So take a few minutes and just give us your observation and experience.
Sure. I'll give you a few minutes. Absolutely. Jarbo Gap, Concow area has significant fire history. Going back to when I was a firefighter, usually we have a very large fire almost every 10 years. Unfortunately, prior to 2018, my wife and I made a trip up to the Gray Eagle Blairsden area, and I drove through Jarbo Gap, and I was telling her the fire history, and I said, you know what? Jarbo Gap's due. And I mean that with all due respect, just because I know the fire history. And so the morning of November 8th, I knew we were under a red flag warning. About 6 o'clock, I looked at the weather. The winds were blowing very significantly all over the valley, and I happened to look at the Jarbo Gap remote weather, and it's blowing 50 to 60. And I said to myself, I really hope we don't get a fire today. Got in the shower. By the time I got in the shower to go to work, my phone had gone off. Vegetation, Jarbo Gap. I heard the size up of where the fire was. I knew it wasn't good. Started heading that way. I was assigned as public information officer to the incident command post. Knowing the fire history and knowing who the incident commander was at that time, both of us had fought fire in that area. And what we do is we draw a box, keep the fire in the box. He drew a box, and by the time he was done drawing a box, within 1 hour, we heard that it jumped into across the west branch of the Feather River. And both of us looked at each other and said, that fire's not supposed to do that. And we're talking an hour to hour and 15 minutes. It went about 8 miles. So that completely changed our strategy and tactics. Along with law enforcement, began evacuations on the eastern side of Paradise. By the time we started that fire was already on the west side of Paradise. So I saw fire behavior that I never want to see again. When people ask me about this fire and if there was a checklist of A to Z, meeting that fuel, weather, topography, and other factors, it hit all of them. It was doing things that we did not expect it to do. And just like, unfortunately, like Pete's experience with the wine country fires, which I was on duty that night also, we destroyed a town in less than 12 hours, if not less than that. And from a fire perspective, we've never seen that other than the wine country fires. And I remember after Santa Rosa, I said to myself, how do you destroy 5,000-6,000 homes in 12 hours? That's unheard of. Well, God forbid it happened again. And what we're talking about here, and what they're bringing to the table is we need, as I started this conversation, we need to present tools to give communities the best chance of surviving. I've said it before, average wildfire behavior, but bringing fire guys in and guys and gals and saying, hey, let's look at the worst case scenario also, and providing what you can do to lessen the damage to communities and your structures. So the campfire, I did public information officer for 48 hours, was assigned damage inspection, which there were only 6 of us to start out with. And I was like, I'll be working till Christmas, but we got that done by Thanksgiving, got every structure accounted for, damaged or destroyed. And then after that, I had the opportunity for repopulation, which was kind of on the other end of the spectrum, getting people back home and who could go home or at least get closure to get back into the communities, because it was very unsafe with the power. Everything was very unsafe. We did not allow anybody in. So working with utility companies, the sheriff, I headed that group up to get people back in to get some closure with regards to this destructive event.
Wow.
And I was hopefully home by Christmas, and which I was.
Wow. Thank you. Man, it occurs to me that we're about out of time, so I want to give you a chance for some final thoughts. Each of you to kind of conclude with, maybe a final takeaway message or mention something that we forgot to touch on. So who wants to go first? It looks like Molly does. Okay, she smiled. She looked at me.
I was thinking Pete or John should go first, actually. I was just really impressed with all the questions. It sounds like the participants in this class have a really high level of understanding already of the WUI and wildfire issues. I did just mention a resource that's coming out, supposed to be out this summer as a public draft, is the Governor's Office of Planning and Research will be issuing an updated fire hazard planning general plan technical advice series. And I know CAL FIRE, I think CAL FIRE has had a lot of input on that. Anyway, based on what I know of that draft, there should be a lot of good additional guidance on the development of general plan policies for wildfire in that. So just wanted to call attention to that. I think one of the key points we hadn't really talked about today, but just what the future holds in terms of climate change, being in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis and facing a lot of uncertainties. And so I think in some ways that makes our jobs harder, but more important than ever. And it's exciting to see the interest in this class. And I really hope that everyone, besides just those of us on the call, but, I see us as ambassadors for why this is important and what we can do about it. So I just appreciate the opportunity to be here today and give some thoughts.
Great. Thank you for that. John? Any final closing thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I think, what's great about us as the community or as a nation or as a neighborhood is that when faced with disasters that are unforeseen or never seen before and hope to never see again, is that we all come together collectively as a group with different perspectives, ideas, and thoughts, not to prevent it, as I said before, but to help and aid that it doesn't impact as bad as it should. And I think that's what all of us bring to the table. And I appreciate the opportunity to come and say this, and I'd like to thank Molly and Pete, Molly specifically, because she helped a community that I'm very fond of, Mammoth Lakes, with one. I think you did a plan for them. And, it's just coming to the table and I love living out here, and I have all my life, and I think people do. And like I said to you, Tim, aside from what Ken Pimlott, former director of CAL FIRE, said, that just tell people to stop living there. Well, that's not realistic. So let's put everything on the table with different ideas and thoughts to give our communities the best chance of surviving a destructive wildfire, which is going to happen again. In some capacity. I hope it's not on the 2018 or 2017 scale, but people live there, and let's give people the best chance to survive one of these and their property to survive. So thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, John. Pete, I'll give you the second to the last word.
Well, I would certainly echo the comments that Molly and John both provided. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share and talk about these issues, and I hope that your students have found it valuable. One of the things that the closing thing that I would emphasize is going back to something Molly said a while back. And I think she was being really modest because she should have held up her Planning Advisory Service booklet one more time there. But the message is that we can do this as planners. This is not at all out of our wheelhouse. This is, I think, it's exactly the kind of thing that a lot of planners train for, and we can increase our understanding of fire behavior, fire ecology, the interaction between wildland fuels and wildland fires and the built environment. We can increase our understanding of all those things and help our communities make better choices. We can do this, and I think the best place to start, if I was going to be pointing to anybody in your audience today, would be with Molly's book, because that was the realization that I came away with after reading it. Was these are not foreign concepts to me. These are not, this isn't Greek to me at all. I read this, I understand it. We can do this.
We can do this. Well, I'm amazed at how quickly 2 hours went by. You guys are awesome. I appreciate the engagement of the students as well with their questions. We'll see where this goes from here. I want to say thank you to my panel members, Pete, Molly, John, and thank you for the students' engagement. And with that, I'm going to close this. Don't go away. I'm going to close this, stop this recording, and say, great job, everybody. Thank you.